It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a final conversation, no clear ending, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. But something in you stopped, not caring, not feeling, but hoping. That quiet hope you carried, that things would change, that they would show up differently, that it would eventually feel right, that something would shift. If you just gave it a little more time, you held on to that longer than you realized. Not loudly, not desperately, but consistently, in the way you stayed open, in the way you kept giving the benefit of the doubt, in the way you didn't fully let go, because part of you was still waiting. But then, something changed, not in them, in you. You stopped hoping, and instead of feeling empty, something inside you settled. Hope didn't keep you there by accident. It served a purpose, a quiet one, a powerful one, because as long as you were hoping, you weren't fully facing what was actually happening. You were holding space for what it could become, for what it might turn into, for what you believed was still possible if things just shifted. And that kind of hope doesn't feel irrational when you're in it. It feels patient, understanding, open. You tell yourself, people take time, things evolve, not everything is immediate. So you stay, not stuck, but invested in the idea that something deeper is still forming. And while you're holding that idea, you naturally adjust. You give more room, more understanding, more time for things to become what you feel they could be. Because hope softens what you're experiencing. It makes inconsistency feel temporary. It makes distance feel explainable. It makes misalignment feel like something that can be worked through if you just don't give up too soon. And that's why it's so powerful. It doesn't deny reality. It reshapes how you interpret it. It allows you to stay connected to something, even when parts of it don't fully align, because you're not just responding to what is. You're holding space for what could be, and that space keeps your emotional investment active. It keeps you engaged. It keeps you present, even when something feels off, because you're not ready to close the possibility. You're not ready to fully accept that this might be as far as it goes. And that reluctance isn't weakness, it's care. It's your ability to see depth before it's fully realized, to feel potential before it becomes stable, to stay open instead of shutting down at the first sign of inconsistency. But over time, that same hope starts to create something else. Tension, not obvious at first, but present, a quiet pull between what you feel and what you're experiencing, between what you believe is possible and what is actually being shown to you over time. And that pull requires energy to maintain because you're holding two realities at once: what is and what you hope it will become. And the longer those two don't align, the more effort it takes to keep them together. You start noticing the moments that don't match your expectation, the gaps that don't close, the patterns that repeat instead of shift. But instead of fully letting that land, you soften it with hope. Maybe it just needs time. Maybe it's not the right moment. Maybe it will change. And every time you say that, you extend your stay in the same emotional space. Because hope keeps you there, not forcefully, but gently, quietly, consistently, until something inside you starts to feel the weight of it. Not the hope itself, but the tension it's holding in place. And that's where the shift begins. Not because you stop caring, but because your body can no longer hold both realities without feeling it. The moment it shifts isn't dramatic. It's subtle, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention, because nothing suddenly breaks. Nothing clearly ends. Everything on the surface still looks the same. But internally, something starts to feel heavier. What once felt like patience now feels like waiting. What once felt like understanding now feels like excusing. What once felt like possibility now feels like repetition. And that difference changes how everything lands. Inside you, you begin noticing the same patterns, without the same optimism attached to them, the same distance, without the same explanation, softening it, the same inconsistency, without the same belief that it will eventually resolve. And when that belief starts fading, the emotional experience changes with it. You're no longer buffered by expectation. You're seeing things as they are, in real time, without adjusting their meaning to make them easier to stay in. That clarity doesn't come all at once. It builds through small recognitions, moments where something happens, and instead of interpreting it, you simply register it. They didn't follow through. The effort didn't match. The pattern repeated again. And instead of filling in the gap with reasoning, you let the moment stand on its own. And that's new. Before, you would have softened it, given context, added meaning that made it easier to hold. But now, you're not doing that. In the same way, you're allowing reality to be direct, unedited, unexplained. And because of that, it starts landing differently in your body. There's less movement toward it, less reaching, less internal effort to keep things aligned. Instead, there's stillness, not empty, but observant. You notice more, but engage less. You see more clearly, but feel less pulled to respond. And that's where the weight begins to reveal itself. Because without the layer of expectation, what remains is the truth of the dynamic. And if that truth hasn't been meeting you, you feel it now without distortion, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet knowing that keeps returning. Nothing is shifting, not in the way you once believed it would, not in the way you kept allowing space for. And that knowing does something important. It interrupts the internal cycle, the one that kept reframing, reinterpreting, reopening the same emotional loop. That cycle starts to slow down because there's less fuel behind it, less narrative holding it together, less belief that something new is about to happen if you just stay a little longer. And when that cycle slows, you feel the difference immediately. There's less urgency, less anticipation, less emotional tension in your system. But before the calm fully arrives, there's a moment in between where everything feels a bit unfamiliar because you're no longer holding on to expectation, but you haven't fully released it yet either. You're just seeing clearly without trying to change what you see. And that clarity can feel quiet but decisive. It doesn't argue. It doesn't push. It doesn't try to convince you. It simply shows you what has been there all along, without the filter you once placed over it. And once you see it that way, something inside you stops trying, not outwardly, internally. The effort to hold both realities begins to fade. The need to keep reconciling what is with what could be starts dissolving, and in its place, something quieter begins to emerge. Not yet relief, but release in motion. The moment it finally releases is almost quiet. No announcement, no dramatic decision, no final push to let go. It just happens, gently, naturally, like something inside you has reached its limit, without needing to say it out loud. You wake up one day, and the pressure isn't there anymore. That internal pull to keep figuring it out, to keep revisiting it, to keep holding space for something to shift. It's gone, not because you forced it away, but because you stopped feeding it. And without that constant mental and emotional effort. Your system begins to settle. You notice it in small ways first. You're not checking the same things, not replaying the same conversations, not revisiting the same questions that once kept looping in your mind. The urge to go back into it just isn't there. And that absence feels unfamiliar at first because for so long, that tension felt like part of you, part of how you processed, part of how you stayed connected to something that hadn't fully resolved. But now, there's space, quiet space, not filled with answers, not filled with conclusions, just space. And in that space, you feel something new. Stillness, not forced calm, not controlled composure, but a natural settling. The kind that happens when your body is no longer trying to hold two realities at once, when it's no longer carrying expectation alongside experience, when it's no longer working to keep possibility alive. That work has ended, and with it, the tension that came with it begins to dissolve. You don't feel pulled in the same way. You don't feel the need to check if anything has changed. You don't feel that internal push to give it more time or more understanding because something has already concluded inside you, not through logic, not through a decision you sat down and made, but through repeated experience. That finally landed. And once it lands, fully, your system responds. It lets go of the effort. It lets go of the waiting. It lets go of the quiet hope that kept everything slightly open. And what replaces it isn't emptiness, it's peace. A grounded, uncomplicated kind of peace. The kind that doesn't ask anything from you. The kind that doesn't require you to keep thinking or processing or adjusting. It just is. And that's when you realize how much energy you were using before, how much of your attention was tied up in something that never fully settled, how much of your emotional space was occupied by trying to reconcile what you felt with what you were experiencing. And now, without that effort, you feel lighter, not because everything is perfect, but because something inside you has finally stopped working so hard, stopped trying to make sense of something that wasn't changing, stopped holding space for a version of reality that never fully arrived. And that's the shift. You didn't force yourself to let go. You stopped holding on. And in that release, your entire system reorganized into something quieter, steadier, more at ease. What comes after the settling isn't confusion, it's clarity, the kind that doesn't need constant thinking to hold itself together, the kind that feels steady, even in silence. Because once the hope falls away, you're left with what is real, not what you imagined, not what you tried to nurture into existence, but what was actually there all along. And instead of resisting it, you accept it fully, without trying to reshape it into something else. That acceptance doesn't feel like defeat. It feels like alignment. Because for the first time, your inner reality and your outer reality match. There's no gap between what you feel and what you're allowing. No quiet negotiation happening inside you. No internal voice trying to keep something alive that isn't growing. That internal conflict has ended, and in its place, there's a grounded sense of certainty. Not loud, not forceful, just clear. This is what it is, and I'm no longer trying to change it. That moment is where your energy returns to you. All the attention you were placing on what might happen comes back. All the emotional space you were holding for something unresolved clears. And suddenly, you're not stretched between two realities anymore. You're here, present, available to yourself again. And that shift changes how you feel in a way that's hard to explain until you've experienced it. There's relief, but not the kind that comes from escape, the kind that comes from no longer carrying something that wasn't yours to carry. There's calm, but not because everything is perfect, because you're no longer in conflict with what's real. There's space, but not emptiness. Clarity, room to breathe without something pulling at you internally. And most importantly, there's self-trust, because you didn't force this shift. You allowed it. You let reality be seen clearly, without rushing to fix it or reshape it. You stayed present long enough for the truth to land on its own. And when it did, you listened. That's what created the settling. Not detachment, not avoidance, but alignment. And once you reach that place, you don't go back to holding on to hope the same way, not because you become closed, but because you become clear. You no longer confuse possibility with reality. You no longer stay in something based on what it could be. You respond to what it actually is. And that shift protects your energy in a way that feels natural, not forced. You don't have to remind yourself to let go. You don't have to convince yourself to move on. Because once something fully lands, your system moves with that truth automatically. That's why this kind of release feels different. It's not something you did. It's something you allowed to happen when you stopped resisting reality. And in that allowance, you didn't lose anything. You returned to yourself, to your clarity, to your peace, to a version of you that isn't divided between what is and what could be. If this resonated with you, then you're already in that shift, the one where you no longer hold internal tension, trying to keep something alive, and instead, you rest in what's real, with calm, clarity, and quiet certainty. Stay with us at Depth of Us, because this space is for women who are no longer holding on to what might be, but standing fully in what is, with self-trust, emotional clarity, and grounded peace.